Get on the floor now." The shout hit my ears before my mind could catch up. The front door burst open so violently it slammed against the wall, rattling the picture frames that Melissa had carefully hung just weeks earlier. Heavy boots pounded across my living room, sharp and fast, as bright beams of flashlights cut through the dim light. For a second, I didn't move. Not because I was defiant, because I was confused. Then I saw the badges, the uniforms. The guns pointed directly at me. My hands rose slowly, almost on instinct. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my mind felt strangely clear, like the world had slowed down just enough for me to see every detail. And then I heard her voice. "I warned you this would happen." Melissa stepped into view behind the officers, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her expression wasn't frightened. It wasn't shocked. It was calm, cold, satisfied. Before I could say a word, a heavy hand shoved my shoulder forward. My balance broke, and the next thing I knew, my cheek slammed into the hardwood floor. The impact echoed inside my skull, sending a dull vibration through my jaw. "Hands behind your back," another officer barked. I obeyed. Not because I believed I had done anything wrong, but because resistance would only make this worse. Metal snapped shut around my wrists. Cold. Tight. Final. Through the open doorway, I saw shapes gathering outside. Porch lights flicked on one by one like a chain reaction across the street. Neighbors stepping onto sidewalks. Phones rising into the air. Someone laughed. Not nervous laughter. Mocking laughter. That sound stayed with me more than the pain in my wrists. One officer reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. He flipped it open, scanned through cards, then stopped at my ID. At first, his face showed nothing. Just routine. Just procedure. Then something changed. His eyes narrowed. His posture stiffened. The movement of his hands slowed, almost freezing midair. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Who else knows about this?" The question didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like concern. They hauled me upright, gripping my arms firmly as they pulled me toward the open doorway. The night air hit my face like a slap, sharp and cold despite the warm desert evening. The crowd outside had grown larger. Mrs. Delgado stood near the edge of her driveway, her gray sweater wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She had baked cookies for us last Christmas. Now she stared at me as if I were someone she didn't recognize. Or worse, someone she finally believed she understood. "What am I being arrested for?" I asked. No one answered. Not the officers. Not Melissa. Not anyone. That silence felt heavier than the cuffs cutting into my wrists. Melissa stepped forward behind the officers, her voice louder now. "Meant for everyone to hear. He's been hiding things from me for years," she said. "I told you this would happen." Her words spread through the crowd like gasoline meeting flame. A man across the street whispered to someone beside him, loud enough for me to hear. I always knew something wasn't right about him. That sentence hit harder than anything else. Not because it was true, but because it was believed. As they led me down the driveway, gravel crunched beneath my shoes. Every sound felt magnified, the rustling of clothing, the clicking of phone cameras, the quiet murmurs spreading from neighbor to neighbor. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Melissa again. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was holding a folder tightly against her chest, her fingers gripping the edges as if it were something valuable, something prepared. That detail stayed with me. That folder didn't belong to panic. It belonged to planning. Someone laughed again as the officers guided me toward the patrol car. The sound followed me like a shadow, stretching longer with every step. They opened the back door and pushed me inside. The metal frame scraped against my shoulder as I slid across the seat. The door slammed shut with a hollow, final sound that echoed through my chest. I sat there, wrists aching behind my back, staring through the metal divider at the empty front seats. What did I miss? What did she do? When did this begin? The officer who had checked my ID walked past the car window again. This time, his face looked different. Not aggressive. Not impatient. uneasy. He paused beside the driver's side door and spoke quietly into his radio, his voice too low for me to hear clearly. But I could hear the tension in it. Urgent. Controlled. Another officer approached him. You sure about that? The second officer asked. The first one didn't answer immediately. He just glanced back at me. Longer this time. Studying. Measuring. Then he spoke into the radio again, his voice tight and deliberate. The energy around the car shifted. Subtle but unmistakable. Moments later, he stepped closer to my window. His posture straighter now. His expression sharper. Different. More careful. More respectful. He lowered his voice again. Just enough for me to hear. Sir, we may need to move you somewhere else. Not suspect. Not criminal. Sir. And for the first time since the cuffs snapped shut around my wrists, I saw something crack across Melissa's face as she watched from the front yard. Confusion. Just a flicker. But it was there. The streetlight slid across my face through the window of the police car. One after another. Like silent questions I didn't yet have answers for. Melissa's voice echoed inside my head. You should have listened to me. The words didn't sound like anger anymore. They sounded rehearsed. Practiced. Like something she had said many times before tonight ever happened. And that was when the realization settled in. This didn't start tonight. It started months ago. 6 months earlier. Life had still felt steady. Predictable. The kind of quiet routine you build over years without even realizing how much you depend on it. Phoenix evenings were always warm that time of year. The air carried the dry scent of sun-baked pavement and distant desert dust. I remember pulling into the driveway just after sunset. The sky painted orange and purple behind the rooftops. Melissa's car was already there. That wasn't unusual. She had been home earlier than me most days since shifting to part-time work. I stepped out of my car, closed the door, and paused for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of our neighborhood. A dog barking somewhere down the street. A lawn sprinkler ticking rhythmically across someone's front yard. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. When I walked inside, the smell of garlic and onions filled the kitchen. Dinner cooking. Routine. Melissa stood at the stove, stirring something in a pan. She didn't turn around right away when I entered, which struck me as odd, though I couldn't explain why at the time. Hey, I said. She glanced over her shoulder, offering a small smile. Not warm. Not cold. Measured. Different. Most evenings, she would greet me with a quick hug or at least a light touch on my arm. That night, she simply nodded and turned back to the stove. How was work? She asked. Busy, I answered, loosening my tie. Nothing unusual. She nodded again, still focused on cooking. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. People have quiet days. Not every moment needed warmth or conversation. Still, something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, stayed with me. We sat down at the dinner table a few minutes later. Plates arranged neatly. Napkins folded perfectly. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Too exactly. We talked about small things at first. Weather. A neighbor repainting his fence. A sale at the grocery store. The kind of conversation that fills silence without saying anything meaningful. Then, halfway through dinner, she asked the first question that would later replay in my mind again and again. How complicated are our finances? Really? Her tone was casual. Too casual. I set my fork down and looked at her. What do you mean? She shrugged slightly, keeping her eyes on her plate. I just realized the other day that I don't really understand how everything is structured, she said. Retirement accounts. Investments. The properties. All of it. At the time, the question didn't feel threatening. It felt reasonable. A spouse wanting clarity about family finances wasn't unusual. So I answered. I explained how our accounts were divided, how the retirement funds were managed, how the property ownership was documented. Years of planning summarized into simple explanations across dinner plates and quiet conversation. She listened carefully. Too carefully. not nodding occasionally like someone trying to follow along. Studying. Watching. "Do you keep copies of everything?" she asked. The question caught me off guard more than the others. "Of course," I said. "Digital backups and physical copies." "Why?" "No reason," she replied quickly. "Just curious." Curious. That word sounded harmless. It always does. A few days later, she mentioned something else. "My son called," she said while folding laundry in the living room. "Eric." I glanced up from the paperwork in my hand. "Haven't heard that name in a while," I said. She nodded. "He's been having some trouble lately. Work hasn't been stable." That didn't surprise me. Eric had always struggled to stay in one place for long. "What kind of trouble?" I asked. "Financial mostly," she said. "He asked if he could stay with us for a while. Just until he gets back on his feet." The word sounded reasonable. Responsible. Even still. Something tightened in my chest. "How long is a while?" I asked. "Just temporary?" she said quickly. "A few weeks. Maybe a month?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, but because something about the timing felt off. Still, I nodded. "All right," I said. "We'll make it work." Eric arrived 3 nights later. He stepped out of a rental car carrying 2 duffel bags and a tired smile. Tall, lean, restless energy radiating from him even before he spoke. "Hey," he said, extending his hand toward me. "Appreciate you letting me stay." "Of course," I replied. His grip was firm, his smile convincing. But his eyes were moving, scanning, not settling. That first night, after dinner, he wandered through the house slowly, pretending to stretch his legs after travel. But I noticed where his attention lingered. Not the living room, not the guest bedroom, the office door. He paused there for half a second longer than necessary. Just enough to notice. Just enough to remember. Later that night, after Melissa and Eric had gone to bed, I walked down the hallway to my office to finish reviewing some documents. That was when I noticed it. The door was slightly open. Not wide. Not obvious. Just enough. Enough to notice. I stopped walking. Stared at it. Every night. I closed that door before heading to bed. Every night. Without fail. I pushed it open slowly. The desk looked normal at first glance. Papers stacked neatly. Laptop closed. Everything in place. Except one thing. The drawer on the right side of my desk. It wasn't fully open. Just cracked. A thin shadow cutting across the wood surface. I stepped closer, my pulse tightening in my chest. Inside the drawer, nothing appeared missing, but something felt wrong. Shifted. Touched. Handled. The next morning, I kept my voice casual when I asked, "Did you need anything from my office last night?" Melissa paused. Just for a second. But it was long enough. "No," she said. Too smooth. Too quick. Later that afternoon, while checking emails at work, I noticed something else. One message marked as read, but I had never opened it. My eyes narrowed as I clicked on it. A bank notification. Login attempt recorded. Late at night. From a device linked to our home network. Not random. Not distant. Inside the house. That evening, I asked again, "Did you use my computer last night?" Melissa didn't hesitate. "No," she said. Too quickly. That same weekend, while collecting mail from the curb, Mrs. Delgado waved from across the street. "Busy household lately," she said with a friendly smile. "Something like that," I replied. She tilted her head slightly. "I saw your stepson going into your office yesterday afternoon," she added casually. "Thought you might have been working from home." I felt the words land before I reacted. "He was—" I asked. She nodded. "I figured you knew." I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and walked back inside. That evening, Melissa sat quietly on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. The blue light flickered across her face, casting sharp shadows beneath her eyes. Then, without warning, she spoke. What happens to everything if something happens to you? The question didn't sound emotional, didn't sound worried. It sounded calculated. I turned slowly toward her. Why would you ask that? I said. She shrugged slightly, her lips forming the faintest smile. Oh, nothing, she replied. Just wondering. Later that night, I lay awake beside her, staring into the darkness, listening to her breathing. Too steady, too controlled. For the first time in years, I got out of bed quietly, walked down the hallway, and locked my office door. Not because I was afraid, because something inside me had started paying attention. For the first time in years, I began checking things twice. Not because I was afraid, because something inside me refused to ignore what I was seeing anymore. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, laying thin stripes of light across the table. Melissa stood at the counter pouring coffee into 2 mugs, her movements calm and practiced. Eric sat at the far end of the table scrolling through his phone, tapping the screen with restless fingers. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I watched them both quietly as I lifted my cup. Busy day ahead? Melissa asked without looking at me. Always, I replied. She nodded once and returned to her coffee. But the air between us felt tighter than it used to. Not hostile. Just measured. Like every movement had meaning now. That morning at work, I opened my laptop like I always did. Same routine. Same rhythm. Password entered. Accounts loaded. Nothing unusual at first. Until a notification appeared in the corner of my screen. Account activity review required. I stared at the message longer than necessary. That notification didn't show up randomly. Not on my accounts. Not with the security layers I had built over years of careful planning. I clicked it. The details loaded slowly. Line by line. An attempted transfer request. Not completed. Not finalized. But started. The timestamp sat there on the screen like a quiet accusation. 2:47 in the morning. While I had been asleep. While the house had been quiet. While I believed everything was still under control. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I scrolled deeper into the system logs. Device information. Location tracking. Access point verification. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. The request didn't come from outside. It came from inside my own home network. Not a stranger. Not a hacker. Someone inside the house. I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't theft yet. It was testing. Testing access. Testing boundaries. Seeing how far they could go. During my lunch break, I sat alone inside my car with my laptop open across the passenger seat. The heat outside pressed against the windows. But inside, the air felt cold. I reviewed the logs again. Every line. Every entry. The device ID matched one of the home-connected units. Not mine. Not the one I used regularly. Which meant someone had tried to access my financial structure without permission. Without knowledge. Without consent. That realization didn't spark panic. It sparked calculation. Someone inside my house was preparing for something. That evening, I arrived home later than usual. The mailbox sat near the front steps, holding the day's deliveries in a neat stack. Bills, advertisements, catalogs, and one envelope that stood out immediately. Heavy, official, thicker than the rest. The return address read Harper & Cole Legal Services. I didn't recognize the name. Never hired them. Never spoken to them. I carried the envelope inside without opening it. The weight of it felt wrong in my hand. Heavier than paper should feel. Melissa stood in the kitchen again, chopping vegetables with slow, careful movements. Anything interesting in the mail? She asked casually. Nothing important, I replied. Not yet. Later that night, alone in my office, I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter printed on crisp paper. The kind of paper used by law firms to make everything look permanent. Asset authorization inquiry. My name printed clearly across the top. My address. My financial references. But I had never authorized anything connected to that firm. Not once. Not ever. I read the letter again. Slower this time. Someone had reached out to them using my name. Without my knowledge. Without my permission. The room felt quieter than usual. The hum of the air conditioning sounded louder than it should have. At dinner that night, I kept my voice calm. Controlled? Neutral. Have you seen anything from a law firm lately? I asked casually. Melissa didn't look up immediately. Eric stopped chewing. Just for a second. But that second stretched long enough to matter. No, Melissa said, lifting her fork again. Why? No reason, I replied. Eric kept his eyes on his plate, avoiding mine. That movement told me more than words ever could. Later that night, when the house finally went quiet, I walked back into my office. Slowly, carefully. The desk lamp cast a dim pool of light across the surface of the desk. That was when I saw it. A folder, placed neatly in the center of the desk. Not mine. Not labeled. Not hidden. Placed deliberately. I stepped closer, my chest tightening with each step. The folder felt heavier than paper should feel when I lifted it. Inside were printed documents, formal formatting, legal structure, official language. My name appeared at the top of the page. Clean, clear, permanent. And then I saw it. My signature, or what was supposed to be my signature. At first glance, it looked convincing. The same slant, the same curve, the same final stroke. But I knew my own handwriting better than anyone. This wasn't mine. It was close. Very close. But wrong. Too perfect in places where mine always showed slight pressure changes. Too smooth where mine carried small imperfections. Someone had practiced. Multiple pages followed behind the first one, each showing variations, attempts, failures, corrections, practice signatures, learning patterns. Someone had been studying how to become me. A cold wave spread through my chest as I flipped through the stack. Not panic, not anger, recognition. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was preparation. The next afternoon, I stepped outside to collect the mail again. Mrs. Delgado stood near her driveway watering her plants, her garden hose spraying a soft arc across the grass. She waved when she saw me. Busy household lately? She said again with a faint smile. Something like that, I replied. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. Your stepson had someone over last night, she said. Didn't look like family. I froze. What do you mean? She shrugged lightly. Man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. Came late. Stayed about 20 minutes. Briefcase. Not groceries. Not tools. Briefcase. Professional. Prepared. I nodded slowly, forcing a polite expression, then walked back inside. That night, I lay in bed staring into the darkness. Melissa slept beside me, her breathing slow and steady. Too steady. Too controlled. My mind replayed everything. The bank alert. The legal letter. The forged signature. The man with the briefcase. All separate events, but connected. Not random. Planned. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why, and started asking something far more important. How far were they willing to go? I slipped quietly out of bed and walked back into my office. Closed the door behind me. Locked it. Then knelt beside my desk. My fingers reached beneath the wooden frame and pressed against a small, hidden panel I hadn't touched in years. The panel slid open with a soft click. Inside was a drawer. One I had built myself. One no one else in this house knew existed. And inside that drawer was something I prepared long before any of this began. I knelt beside my desk and slid the hidden panel open with slow, steady pressure. The wood shifted just enough to reveal the narrow drawer I had built years ago, long before suspicion ever entered my marriage. Dust coated the edges, untouched since the day I sealed it shut. I hadn't expected to use it. Not this soon. Not ever. If I was honest with myself, Inside the drawer sat a thick envelope. Plain. Unmarked except for one word written in black ink across the front. Private. I stared at it for a long moment before touching it. My fingers hovered just above the surface. Hesitating, not from fear, but from recognition. Opening that envelope meant admitting something I had hoped would never be true. That preparation wasn't paranoia. It was necessity. I lifted the envelope slowly and placed it on my desk beneath the glow of the lamp. The paper felt stiff, sealed tight with adhesive that had hardened over time. For a second, my mind drifted backward. 3 years earlier. Back when life still felt predictable. Back when Melissa's questions hadn't started. Back when trust still felt natural. I remembered sitting inside a conference room filled with polished wood and glass walls, reviewing files under bright fluorescent lights. At that time, I worked as a risk compliance consultant, specializing in financial fraud investigations. Most people assumed fraud came from strangers, professional criminals, unknown hackers. But the truth was different. Most fraud began inside relationships, inside businesses, inside families, inside marriages. I learned that lesson the hard way through case files that filled entire cabinets. One case stayed with me longer than the rest. A man in his late 50s had walked into our office carrying a cardboard box filled with documents. His hands trembled as he set it down on the table. Inside were years of financial records, property titles, retirement statements, everything he owned, or thought he owned. His wife had slowly gained access to his accounts over time. Not forcefully, not violently, quietly. She asked questions, requested access, offered to help organize. By the time he realized what was happening, his name had already been removed from key documents, ownership transferred, accounts reassigned, legally, cleanly, without raising suspicion. He didn't lose his wealth overnight. He lost it piece by piece until nothing remained. That case changed how I saw everything. Trust wasn't protection. Documentation was. A few weeks after closing that case, I met with Judge Leonard Shaw, a retired judge who had consulted on several investigations I handled. We sat in a quiet restaurant tucked away from the busy downtown streets, plates untouched as conversation replaced appetite. He spoke calmly, his voice steady and direct. Trust is good, he told me. Documentation is better. I nodded at the time, thinking I understood. But he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. If betrayal ever comes, he added, it won't announce itself first. Those words stayed with me long after the meal ended. They echoed through my mind during quiet evenings at home, when Melissa and I still laughed easily and shared comfortable silence. That was when I decided to prepare, not out of suspicion, out of caution. I arranged meetings with a private legal firm that specialized in asset protection. Quiet meetings, confidential discussions, no shared paperwork at home, no visible changes to daily life. The structure we created wasn't obvious, not public, not easy to trace. Layers of ownership protections, backup clauses triggered under specific conditions, safeguards designed to activate only when necessary. I remembered sitting across from the attorney as he slid the final document across the desk. You'll probably never need this, he said. I hoped he was right. Back in the present, I broke the seal on the envelope. The paper tore softly beneath my fingers. Inside were documents bearing official seals, signatures, and authentication marks. The ink hadn't faded. The pages remained crisp, preserved carefully against time. I spread them across the desk, scanning each line slowly. Every clause, every protection, everything still intact, everything still active. They thought they were preparing against me. They thought they were controlling the situation. But what they didn't know was that I had prepared long before they ever began. Inside the envelope, I found another smaller envelope, thinner, more discreet. Across its surface were printed 3 simple words: open only if necessary. My fingers rested on it, tracing the edges. Opening it meant escalation, not suspicion, not observation, action. I stared at it for several seconds, weighing the decision carefully. Not tonight. Not yet. There was still time to observe. Still time to gather more proof. I placed the smaller envelope back inside the larger one and sealed it carefully before sliding everything back into the hidden drawer. The panel closed with a soft click, sealing the secret once again. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor as Melissa and Eric sat at the table drinking coffee. Their voices blended together in quiet conversation that stopped the moment I entered the room. Too quickly. Too neatly. I poured myself a cup and listened. Eric leaned back in his chair casually, though his eyes flicked toward me more often than necessary. "Do you keep backups of important papers?" he asked suddenly. The question landed harder than it should have. Not random. Not innocent. Calculated. I met his gaze without blinking. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Just curious." That word again. Curious. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting silence fill the room. Now I knew. They weren't guessing anymore. They were searching, preparing, waiting. That night, after the house grew quiet again, I returned to my office and reopened the hidden drawer one more time. The documents lay exactly where I had placed them earlier. Still protected. Still ready. As I reviewed the pages again, one clause caught my eye. A clause I had almost forgotten existed. One designed for a very specific situation. If anyone attempted to remove me from my own property through fraudulent means, the system would not collapse. It would activate. And when it did, it wouldn't protect them. It would expose them. The house grew quieter as the days passed. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought comfort. It was the kind that made every sound feel sharper, every movement louder. Melissa stopped asking questions about finances completely. That alone should have brought relief. But instead it made my chest feel tight. Her silence didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like preparation. Dinner conversations became shorter. Fewer questions. Fewer casual remarks. Eric spent more time on his phone, glancing up only when I entered the room, then looking back down again as if nothing had happened. Too controlled. Too careful. One evening, after dinner, I walked down the hallway toward my office. The lights were dim, the house settling into its usual nighttime rhythm. Melissa remained in the living room watching television, though her eyes didn't seem focused on the screen. When I stepped inside my office, I stopped immediately. My safe. It wasn't wide open, not obviously disturbed, just slightly off. The metal door sat a fraction of an inch ajar, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But I was looking now, always looking. I stepped closer, every movement slow and deliberate. My hand hovered over the safe handle before gripping it firmly and pulling the door open. Inside, everything appeared to be in place. Folders stacked neatly, documents arranged exactly where they should be. But something felt wrong. Subtle. Shifted. I reached in and touched the top folder. The edges didn't line up perfectly the way I always left them. Someone had opened this safe. Not broken into it. Opened it. That meant one thing. Someone had access. Cold anger settled deep in my chest. Not loud. Not explosive. Focused. That night, as I walked past the kitchen on my way to the living room, I heard voices. Low. Whispering. I slowed my steps instinctively, staying just out of sight around the corner. Melissa's voice carried through the doorway, barely above a murmur. Yes, he still doesn't know. The words struck harder than anything else so far. Still doesn't know. My jaw tightened as I listened. We'll move forward soon, she continued. Not uncertain. Not hesitant. Certain. Prepared. I stepped quietly backward before they noticed me, moving away from the hallway as silently as possible. My pulse pounded in my ears, but my breathing stayed steady. That sentence changed everything. Suspicion was over. Confirmation had begun. The next morning, I returned to the safe again. Same careful movement. Same deliberate motion. This time, the difference wasn't subtle. One folder was missing. Not misplaced. Not buried beneath another stack. Gone. I stared at the empty space for several seconds, letting the reality settle in. That missing file wasn't random paperwork. It contained property authorization details, ownership structure references, key documentation that connected everything. That moment confirmed what I had already begun to understand. They weren't curious. They were executing. Later that afternoon, as I pulled into the driveway after work, I noticed something unusual. A car I didn't recognize sat parked near the curb. Dark sedan, engine off. Still, Eric stood near the front walkway speaking to a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore a pressed suit, his posture stiff. Professional. In his hand rested a black briefcase. The same detail, Mrs.? Delgado had mentioned days earlier. Briefcase? Professional. Prepared. They both stopped talking the moment my car rolled into view. Too quickly. Too smoothly. Eric forced a smile as I stepped out of the car. Hey, he said casually. Just talking to someone about paperwork. Paperwork. No name given. No introduction offered. The man nodded politely but said nothing. His grip on the briefcase tightened slightly before he turned and walked back toward the sedan. I watched the vehicle pull away slowly, disappearing down the street without urgency, without explanation. Inside the house that evening, dinner felt heavier than usual. The air carried tension thick enough to feel between breaths. No one spoke much. No one laughed. Artificial calm. That was the only way to describe it. Halfway through the meal, I decided to test something. I reviewed the property paperwork today, I said casually, keeping my voice steady. Melissa froze, just for a fraction of a second. Eric's fork paused midway between plate and mouth. That reaction told me everything. They knew exactly which documents were missing. Melissa forced a small smile. Everything all right? She asked. Everything looks fine, I replied. Not fully true, but necessary. Later that night, I stepped outside to take the trash to the curb. The air outside felt cooler than usual, carrying the distant hum of traffic from the main road. As I rolled the trash bin toward the edge of the driveway, I noticed headlights across the street. A car sat parked in the shadows. Engine running. Lights off. Someone inside. Watching. Not moving. Not leaving. Just waiting. A cold realization settled into my chest. This wasn't random anymore. It was coordinated. Every movement. Every step. Planned. I turned slowly and walked back toward the house without reacting. No sudden movements. No visible concern. Inside, Melissa sat quietly on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Eric stood near the hallway, checking his phone repeatedly. Too restless. Too alert. Minutes passed in silence. Then, faint at first, I heard it. A distant sound, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. A siren, growing louder, closer. Melissa didn't react with surprise. She didn't look confused. She looked ready. Red and blue lights flashed across the living room walls, cutting through the blinds in sharp, moving streaks. The sound grew louder until it filled the entire space. Heavy footsteps approached outside. Authority. Finality. Then came the knock. Hard. Sharp. Unmistakable. Melissa leaned slightly toward me, her voice barely above a whisper. It's time. Not panic. Not fear. Expectation. And in that moment, standing in my own living room as the pounding continued against the door, I understood exactly how far they were willing to go. The door shook beneath the force of another violent knock. Not a polite knock. Not a request. A demand. Open the door. The command thundered through the house. Sharp and final. The red and blue lights flashing through the blinds painted the walls in restless colors, turning my living room into something unfamiliar. Melissa stood a few feet behind me, her posture straight, her face calm. Too calm. Eric paced near the hallway, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. His movements were restless, uneven, like he was waiting for something inevitable. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't argue. I simply walked forward, each step steady, each breath measured. When I reached the handle, I paused for just a second. Then I opened it. The moment the door swung inward, the officers surged forward. Fast, controlled, weapons drawn, authority filling every inch of space. "Get on the floor now." The shout cracked through the room like thunder. Hands went up instinctively. My fingers spread wide, palms visible, movement slow and deliberate. I had seen enough situations like this in my professional life to know one thing: panic made everything worse. "What is this about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. No answer, only movement. Boots crossing hardwood, flashlight sweeping the room. One officer stepped closer, holding a sheet of paper in his hand. His eyes moved between the document and my face. "You are being detained on suspicion of unlawful asset control," he said, his voice cold and precise. Unlawful asset control. The word sounded technical, legal, dangerous. Behind him, Melissa stepped forward. "I told you he was hiding things," she said loudly. Her voice carried across the room. Strong enough to reach the officers. Strong enough to reach the open doorway. Strong enough to reach anyone standing outside. She wasn't whispering. She was performing. The pressure against my shoulder came suddenly. Firm. Unforgiving. I dropped to the floor before resistance even crossed my mind. The hardwood slammed against my cheek, sending a sharp jolt through my jaw. The smell of wood polish filled my nose as the weight of an officer's knee pressed into my back. "Hands behind your back." I moved without hesitation. Not because I believed their accusations. Because I understood procedure. Cold metal snapped around my wrists. Tight. Unyielding. Final. The sound echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off the walls like a declaration. "Outside," voices murmured. The door still stood open. Neighbors gathering. Watching. Recording. Someone laughed. The sound cut through everything else. Sharp and mocking. Not disbelief. Entertainment. I turned my head slightly. Just enough to see movement beyond the threshold. Mrs. Delgado stood near her driveway again. Her face looked tense. Uncertain. She wasn't laughing. But others were. Phones raised. Lights glowing. Capturing everything. Melissa stepped closer behind the officers. Her footsteps measured. "Make sure he doesn't touch anything else," she said. Not emotional. Not shaken. Confident. Like this was the outcome she expected. One of the officers reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet with mechanical efficiency. He flipped it open quickly, scanning through the contents without hesitation. Cards. Cash. Identification. Routine. Then he pulled out my ID. For a moment, nothing changed. His expression stayed neutral as he glanced at it. Another ordinary check in an ordinary arrest. But then, his eyes narrowed. His shoulders stiffened slightly. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable. But I saw it. The officer looked at the ID again. Longer this time. Closer. His breathing shifted. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just slower. More deliberate. He leaned forward slightly, bringing the ID closer to his face as if making sure he hadn't misread it. And then, he froze. Completely still, like something inside him had locked into place. Behind him, another officer spoke. "What's the holdup?" No response. The first officer didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the card in his hand, studying it with an intensity that no longer felt routine. That was when he leaned closer. Close enough that only I could hear him. "Who else knows about this?" he whispered. The question didn't sound like suspicion. It sounded like concern. Inside, I felt something shift. Not relief. Recognition. The plan I had built years ago was working exactly as designed. The officer straightened slowly, his expression changing in ways that were impossible to miss now. The aggression that filled the room moments earlier began to fade, replaced by something else. Caution. Awareness. Another officer stepped closer. Glancing at the ID, "What did you find?" he asked quietly. The first officer hesitated. Just for a second. Then he stepped aside, turning slightly away from the group. He lifted his radio to his mouth, speaking in a low, controlled tone, too low to hear the exact words, but tense enough to feel. Melissa watched closely from across the room. I could see it in her posture now, the small shift in her shoulders, the tightening of her jaw. Something had changed. She knew it. Eric stood near the hallway, his face pale, his restless movements slowing. The room no longer felt loud. No shouting, no rushing, just quiet tension spreading across every surface. Moments later, the officer returned to my side. He didn't shove me, didn't bark commands. Instead, he crouched slightly, lowering his voice again. "Sir," he said carefully, "we need you to come with us separately. Sir. Not suspect. Not criminal. Sir." That single word changed the air between us. Across the room, Melissa stared at me, confusion beginning to replace the confidence she had carried all night. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time since the cuffs snapped around my wrists, I saw doubt flicker across her face. Just a flicker, but enough. Enough to know that whatever she believed would happen next was no longer certain. They didn't push me into the back seat this time. Instead, one of the officers opened the front passenger door and gestured toward it. "Sir, please sit here. Please." Not an order. Not a command. A request. That single difference carried more weight than the cuffs still tight around my wrists. I stepped carefully toward the vehicle, aware of every movement behind me. Melissa stood near the front yard, watching closely. Her expression had changed completely now. The calm confidence she wore earlier had cracked, replaced by uncertainty. Eric stood beside her, silent, his jaw tight. As I lowered myself into the front seat, the officer closed the door gently, not forcefully. The sound didn't echo the way the earlier slam had. Not punishment. Procedure. Across the street, neighbors still lingered under porch lights, whispering to each other. Phones remained raised. But the energy had shifted. Less excitement. More confusion. The drive to the station passed in silence. Streetlights flickered across the windshield in slow intervals, casting shadows across the officer's face. His grip on the steering wheel remained firm, his posture stiff but controlled. He didn't speak. Neither did I. When we arrived at the police station, the doors opened automatically, revealing bright fluorescent lights that felt harsh against my tired eyes. Everything inside looked clean, orderly, precise, controlled. Melissa and Eric arrived moments later in a separate vehicle. That difference didn't go unnoticed. They were escorted inside together, their movements more rigid now, less confident than before. I was guided down a hallway instead of toward a holding cell. That detail alone sent a ripple through Melissa's expression as she watched from across the room. Her eyes followed me, searching, trying to understand. Inside a small office, an officer motioned for me to sit in a chair near the desk. He placed my ID carefully on the surface, treating it with a level of respect that hadn't existed earlier. The room smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Another officer entered seconds later. Older, more experienced. His presence carried authority without needing to raise his voice. He picked up the ID and studied it closely. For a moment, no one spoke. Then his expression shifted. Not shock. Recognition. He looked at the first officer. "You verified this?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. The older man nodded slowly before placing the ID back onto the desk. That silence carried meaning. Heavy meaning. Moments later, Melissa was escorted into the room. She walked in with controlled steps, clutching the folder she had held all night. But her confidence had faded now. Her eyes moved rapidly across the room, searching for reassurance she could no longer find. She sat across from the desk, placing the folder down carefully. "I provided everything you asked for," she said quickly. "All the documents are there." The officer opened the folder and began reviewing the contents one page at a time. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting beneath his fingers. Then he paused. Just for a second. This signature, he said calmly, tapping a section of the page. Where did you obtain this authorization? Melissa swallowed visibly. He signed it, she replied. I watched him. Her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. The officer placed her document beside another official file pulled from the desk drawer. Side by side. Comparison made simple. Obvious. Clear. These don't match, he said. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Factually. Melissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Her breathing grew uneven. Eric was brought into the room next. The moment he stepped inside, tension filled the space. He looked from Melissa to the officers, then to me, avoiding eye contact. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the cold air inside the room. Who introduced you to the attorney? The older officer asked. Simple question. Direct. Eric opened his mouth, then closed it again. Hesitation. Too long. Suspicious. I just needed help, he said finally. Someone recommended him. Who? The officer pressed. Silence. Eric's shoulders stiffened. His confidence collapsed quickly, like a structure built on weak foundations. The man with the briefcase, he muttered finally. He handled the paperwork. That single admission changed everything. Documents were spread across the desk now, arranged carefully into a timeline. Email logs, access records, financial attempts, every piece forming a clear pattern. Forgery attempts traced, unauthorized entries recorded, each action documented, each mistake preserved. Melissa stared at the evidence as it unfolded in front of her. Her breathing became shallow. Her lips trembled slightly. What does this mean? She asked weakly. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued reviewing each page methodically, step by step, until the full picture stood visible to everyone in the room. Attempted fraud, unauthorized access, false reporting, every layer exposed. Melissa turned toward me slowly. Her eyes widened. Not angry, not defensive. Realizing? You knew, didn't you? She whispered. Not accusing. Understanding. I met her gaze calmly. I prepared, I replied quietly. Nothing more. Nothing less. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the strength draining from her posture as reality settled in around her. Eric sat frozen beside her, silent now, no longer speaking, no longer pretending control. The older officer finally spoke again. This matter will continue under investigation, he said in a steady tone. Further charges may apply depending on findings. The words carried weight. Not emotional. Legal. Final. Moments later, I was escorted outside the station. The night had faded into early morning. Soft sunlight stretched across the horizon, breaking through the darkness that had surrounded everything just hours earlier. Fresh air filled my lungs. Cool. Clean. Quiet. An officer walked beside me, his posture more relaxed now. You were ready for this, weren't you? He asked quietly. Not suspicious. Curious? Respectful. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I gave a small nod, because the truth was simple. Preparation had saved me, and as I stood there in the pale morning light, watching the sky shift from darkness to day, one thought settled deeply inside my mind. What came next wouldn't be survival. It would be consequence. The silence in my new apartment felt different from the silence in my old house. This silence didn't carry secrets. It didn't carry whispers behind closed doors or the sound of footsteps stopping when I entered a room. It didn't carry the tension of knowing someone was searching through my belongings while pretending to smile at dinner. This silence felt earned. Morning sunlight filtered through the wide window, spilling across the hardwood floor in clean lines. The apartment was smaller than the house I left behind, but it felt lighter, simpler, safer. I stood by the kitchen counter, holding a cup of coffee, letting the quiet settle around me. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't tight. For the first time in months, I wasn't listening for movement behind me. Peace didn't come all at once. But it came one steady breath at a time. Weeks had passed since the night of the arrest. Weeks of paperwork, meetings, signatures, and conversations that felt more like chess moves than daily life. Every decision mattered now. Every step documented. That morning, I sat across from my attorney inside a quiet office. Stacks of papers spread across the table between us. The investigation confirmed multiple irregularities, he said calmly. Forgery attempts were documented. Unauthorized access records were verified. His tone remained steady. Professional, not emotional. That made it easier to hear. Melissa remained under investigation. The outside attorney Eric had contacted was also being reviewed for involvement in document manipulation. Nothing moved quickly in legal matters, but the direction was clear. They had crossed lines that couldn't be erased, and now those lines were being traced back to them. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt quiet, heavy. Necessary? A few days later, Melissa requested a meeting. Not at the house. Not anywhere familiar. A law office conference room. Neutral ground. When she walked into the room, I barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. Gone was the calm confidence she once carried. Gone was the careful posture and rehearsed tone. Her shoulders sagged slightly. Her eyes tired. Her movements hesitant. For the first time in years, she avoided my gaze. She sat across from me slowly, placing her hands on the table as if unsure where to rest them. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said quietly. "Not an apology, an explanation, or maybe an excuse." I studied her for a moment before answering. "You planned it," I said calmly. "You moved documents. You made calls. You filed accusations." My voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't accuse. It stated facts. Her lips parted slightly, but no immediate response came. She looked down at the table instead, tracing the grain of the wood with her eyes. "I thought," she began, then stopped. Thought what? That I wouldn't notice. That preparation belonged only to her. The silence between us filled the room, heavy but necessary. "I trusted you," I said finally. Not loudly, not angrily. Simply, that statement landed harder than any accusation could have. Her shoulders dropped further, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled in fully. That was the last conversation we had alone. Later that week, I signed the final paperwork closing every joint financial account connected to her name. The documents lay spread across the desk like the final chapters of a long story. One by one. Permissions were removed, access revoked, control restored. No shouting, no revenge speech, just quiet action. The strongest kind. Money had never been the real issue. Control had, security had, freedom had. A few days after the paperwork was finalized, I returned to the house one last time. Not to stay, not to argue, to close a chapter. The driveway looked smaller than I remembered. The front door stood exactly as it had the night everything changed, but it no longer carried the same meaning. Inside, the house felt hollow, echoing. Rooms once filled with routine now stood empty of comfort. I walked slowly through the living room, past the hallway, toward my office. That room had always been my place of focus, my place of control, my place of preparation. Now it stood quiet, still, neutral. I stepped inside and looked at the desk. The same desk where I had discovered the first signs. The same desk where I opened the hidden drawer. The same desk where everything shifted. I ran my hand lightly across the surface once, then stepped back. No anger. No regret, just understanding. Trust, once broken, never returned in the same form. Outside, I stood at the edge of the driveway, holding the keys in my hand. The weight of them felt familiar, heavy, symbolic. For a moment, I looked back at the house. Not with longing, not with sadness, with clarity. The real danger had never been losing money. It had been losing control of my life. Preparation had protected me. Not luck. Not chance. Preparation. Weeks later, inside my new apartment, I set up my desk near the window. Fresh documents arranged neatly. Copies secured. Backups stored in multiple locations. No hidden drawers this time. No secrets. Just order. Just structure. Just awareness. Some endings don't feel like losses. They feel like rescue. That night, as the sun dipped below the skyline outside my window, I sat quietly in the dim light, thinking back to the moment everything changed. The night the police entered my home. The moment the cuffs snapped around my wrists. The second the officer froze when he checked my ID. That moment didn't destroy my life. It revealed the truth hidden beneath it. You don't win by shouting louder. You don't win by reacting faster. You win by preparing better. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that betrayal rarely arrives without warning. The signs are always there, small, quiet, easy to ignore if you choose comfort over awareness. But when you notice them, when you act on them, you give yourself power no one else can take away. And if you've ever faced betrayal, whether from family, from someone you trusted, or from someone who believed you wouldn't fight back, I want you to know something. You are not alone in that feeling. Many people sit in silence, pretending everything is fine while something inside them whispers that it isn't. If you've lived through something like that, I'd truly like to hear your story. Share it. Speak it. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is tell the truth out loud. And if this story made you think about your own experiences, or reminded you of moments when you had to stand your ground, stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about justice, about boundaries, about people who thought they had lost everything until the tables turned. If you believe in protecting yourself, in learning from hard moments, and in seeing justice unfold when people least expect it, consider staying here, listening, and being part of this journey. Because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change your life forever